can only ask a people to sacrifice everything, blood, toil, tears and sweat, the works, when they feel the real sense of danger, when they feel the sense of an impending invasion. And the irony of the Blitz and things like that is it didn't crush British morale, it brought Brits far more together. If Hitler had stopped after the fall of France, maybe he consolidates in the Balkans, maybe he invades Spain, but if he didn't begin to attack Britain, if he didn't attack the Soviet Union, after a while, the voices of appeasement, those voices which would have resurfaced, because everyone knew that there was a potential case of stalemate here.
What mistakes did Hitler make, and what strategies and potential luck did the Allies have to turn the course of the war? So one of the mistakes, obviously, is going into Russia. Don't you agree? I mean, I think that was a big mistake. He could have controlled most of Central and Western Europe had he not done that for a pretty long period of time. What are some of the mistakes and what are some of the strategies you think that were successful for the Allies?
Undoubtedly, the invasion of the Soviet Union is the greatest mistake, a cataclysmic mistake. But before that, a slightly less obvious one, though tied to it, would be if Hitler had continued the invasion of France with the invasion of Spain, and there were plans for this, it was known as Operation Felix, then the Germans could have closed the Mediterranean to the British, and suddenly all of Britain's Middle Eastern and North African interests are severely imperiled. German U-boats operating off the west coast of Spain could have wreaked havoc on Britain's Atlantic convoys, Britain's lifeline during the Second World War. And it was this that Hermann Goering, Hitler's right-hand man, when he was incarcerated at the end of the war, told his American interrogator had been the Führer's greatest mistake. He said it was his failure to invade Spain. I also think at the time when Britain is alone, what Churchill is obviously an incredibly inspiring figure and his words have a great effect, but you can only ask a people to sacrifice everything, blood, toil, tears and sweat, the works, when they feel the real sense of danger, when they feel the sense of an impending invasion. And the irony of the Blitz and things like that is it didn't crush British morale, it brought the Brits far more together. If Hitler had just stopped after the fall of France, maybe he consolidates in the Balkans, maybe he invades Spain, but if he didn't begin to attack Britain, if he didn't attack the Soviet Union, after a while, the voices of appeasement, those voices which I wrote about in my first book, would have resurfaced, because everyone knew that there was a potential case of stalemate here. Mm-hmm. Because of the Royal Navy and because of the RAF, Britain could survive, but she could not win. Britain couldn't win without allies. Britain needed the US, Britain needed the Soviet Union. And after a while of 2 or 3 years of extreme rationing and all the other hardships of war, people would have sort of started to ask, well, what's the exit strategy here? What does victory look like? The US isn't coming into the war, and we could talk about this, but I really don't think that you ask what were moments of Allied luck. As tragic as it was, Pearl Harbor turned out to be a massive bit of Allied luck, because I don't really believe that the US was coming in anytime soon were it not for Pearl Harbor.
Well, when let me ask you this. It's hypothetical, of course, but Hitler declares war on the U.S. right after Pearl Harbor, before the United States can declare war on Hitler. Do you think Roosevelt would have declared war on Germany, contemporaneous to Japan?
No, and Roosevelt was very clear on this. There were members of the Roosevelt administration who said, Mr. President, you've got to take advantage of this. You know, the people's blood is up. We can even manufacture links between Germany and Japan. We can say the Germans helped them. And he is so cautious. We're all prisoners, Anthony, of our own history and our own experience. And right. FDR had watched as his hero, Woodrow Wilson, had got ahead of US public opinion and US congressional opinion and been unable to sell the Treaty of Versailles, sell the League of Nations to a highly isolationist American public. And FDR was determined that he wasn't going to do that. So in his famous speech to Congress, where he asks for a declaration of war, there's only, by the way, one moment of rhetoric, which is the famous Day of Infamy moment. There's not a single mention of Germany. And while I do think that thereafter America would have joined the European war by the nature of alliances, Japan and Germany working together, it would have happened at some stage. it could have taken quite a long time. It certainly wouldn't have been imminent. So that was another massive bit of luck for the Allies.
Yeah. So I think, again, the thing that I'm also fascinated by in your book is that there's so many incidental things that are happening. We read history like it's a Hollywood script and there's a happy ending, at least for the Allies. But the way your book reads to me is there was so many improbable things that had to happen for us to have the ending that we ultimately had. I guess one of the things that struck me in the book, and you have these unbelievable, unexpected details in this book, but one of the things that struck me is in 1942, British readers were pro-Russian. They were reading War and Peace. It became a bestseller, as you point out in the book. What do moments like that tell us about how public sentiment shifted with the alliance?
Well, there were foreign policy experts in both Britain and in the State Department, famously George Kennan and people like that, who despaired of the fact that the British and the Americans were swept up with pro-Soviet sentiment.
Yeah. Uncle Joe, right, Tim?
Uncle Joe. And after the Wehrmacht had been driven back from the gates of Moscow and then been encircled at Stalingrad. And it's very interesting. The Soviet Union was far ahead of Britain in polls taken in America of which allies you admired most, because they were doing most of the fighting. The biggest battles were being fought on the Eastern Front, and everyone was prepared to forget what Uncle Joe had done in the 1930s. And even people who were deeply anti-communist. There's, a lovely memorandum I found in an archive, which I put in the book, showed the British ambassador, Lord Halifax, being questioned by a group of Republican congressmen just after Operation Barbarossa. So America's not yet in the war. Hitler's just invaded the Soviet Union. And these Republican congressmen are really skeptical of the idea of allying with Soviet Russia. And Halifax, who was very anti-Soviet himself, just said, a man at the bottom of a hole will accept the arm of a gorilla, even if it's his only way out.
Right.
And the Republican congressman said, well, but what if the gorilla turns on you when you get out of the hole? And he said, we will cross that bridge when we come to it. Yeah. And that was it. That everyone's making sacrifices. The great sacrifices the British and the Americans are making politically are they're having to sacrifice their principles. And they're having to make a real moral judgment and strategic judgment as to what is the primary enemy here. And they're having to say to themselves that, yeah, it's better to go along with Uncle Joe's lies about the massacre of some 21,000 Polish officers in the Katyn forest. It's better to not break up the alliance over the Soviet failure to help the Poles in the Warsaw Uprising. It's okay to accept all of these incredibly hypocritical remonstrances from Uncle Joe about you not throwing division after division across the channel to be mown down by German machine guns. All of this has to be done for the bigger picture.